Hello friends, and welcome back to the Ultimate Gaming Creepypasta Iceberg. This video will cover part 2. I hope you all enjoy it. Ultima Abyss is a story set around the Ultima series of games, which are RPGs that predate Final Fantasy. The story was uploaded to the wiki in 2012 by Review Games H, but I couldn't find the author of the story. Ultima Abyss starts with the narrator explaining the BBS and Wares scene of the late 1980s. BBS stands for Bulletin Board Systems. Wares means sharing games over the internet or piracy. Of course, he never considered it piracy, and more so just people sharing games. Of all the games he played through this swap system, his favorites were always the RPGs. The two games that he liked the most were Wizardry and Ultima. Both of these series were very popular in the BBS scene. One day the narrator's friend Jeff, who went under the alias Lord Camaro, pulled him aside and showed him a stack of floppy disks. They were all marked with one word in black marker: Abyss. He notes that this wasn't uncommon for games being traded in the Wares scene. Jeff claimed to have received the game from a BBS in Texas. Texas was also where the developer of Ultima were located, so for a second they thought it might be official. The only note that the pair had about the game was that it was a strange take on the Ultima formula. Considering how different 4 and 5 were from prior games, he didn't see this as odd. The narrator took the games home, booted up his Commodore 64, and started his adventure. The first thing he noticed was the shift in tone. Ultima usually had an adventurous theme, but for some reason, this game was mournful and sinister. The game starts with the player character from the prior game. The narrator imported his character from 5. Being sent to Britannia. The player character was being escorted by friends from the prior games, but their portraits all made them look aged and thin. This was especially true for Jonna. She was the one to explain that Lord British had fallen ill with a mysterious disease. But not only that, he was also descending into madness. As the ship sailed, it would be sucked into a whirlpool. The narrator watched his companions all be taken by the whirlpool as the game faded to black. It faded back in as the avatar was washed ashore in Britannia. He immediately tried to talk to those around him, but every NPC refused to speak to him. He tried to get an audience with Lord British, but the man said that he had never laid eyes on him before. This also had the avatar sent to the dungeons. In the dungeons, there were only 2 options given: speak with the jester or rest. Every time the narrator rested, a status would read out 1 year later. The narrator rested around 40 times by his estimate, but noticed that the jester had turned into a skeleton by the 15th. This wasn't the only change. The portrait had changed to that of an old man, and his stats had also decreased over the years. Eventually a guard would come down to the cell and offer a way out for the avatar. He was to kill the traitors, and he would be set free. These traitors were his old companions. So he was set free just to hunt down his friends. The first friend that the avatar came into contact with was murdered on sight by him. It was done in a very gruesome manner. This same action would follow with all companions going forward. They would just appear no matter where the avatar went. Once all of his companions were dead, the guard appeared again. Here's an excerpt from the story. The jail guard appeared once more. Lord British has passed. He hath not an heir, but a final request for the avatar. Lord British's last command was to descend once again into the Stygian abyss and cast the Codex of Ultimate Wisdom, the magic tome that could always provide a just answer into lava in the deepest pits of the abyss. The guard seemed possessed. He pushed my character to a waiting ship bound for the abyss, but uttered, "I hope you fail," as his bon voyage. And the strangeness continued. My old avatar in rags and armed only with rusted weapons descended into the abyss. The narrator made his way to his destination. He was aided by those that would normally be enemies in the Ultima series. It was odd, but so was the rest of the game so far. He eventually found Dupree, one of his old allies. He engaged in combat with him, but was defeated. Dupree, as punishment, sealed the avatar away in a cell. It was just like before, but there was nothing left to do but rest and talk to no one. When the narrator pressed talk, only one phrase would pop up. Thy fate is to starve here, die forgotten and alone. The narrator was done with the game by this point. He wanted to leave his room, but found that the door was stuck. He pushed with all his might, but it wouldn't budge. He turned his Commodore 64 back on and formatted the disks. Only then would his door finally open and the pressure he felt in the air dissipate. Sometime later, the narrator would get back into contact with his friend Jeff. They discussed games like they always did, but the conversation turned to Abyss at one point. Jeff seemed reluctant to talk about it, but explained what he went through. It was slightly different from his own experience. During his fight with Dupree, he'd actually won. Thus, he threw the codex into the lava. He was given a message that stated that he was free of his responsibilities, his morals, and his friends. He was told to revel in his freedom. After this, he went back to the castle and found a skeleton on the king's throne. He pushed it aside and watched as it fell to dust. Under the throne were a few items. One was a piece of parchment from Lord British. It simply read, "I am not myself lately." After finding this note, his discs erased themselves. There was nothing left of Ultima Abyss. Even the discs not in his system had somehow been erased. It was weird, but he was just glad to be done with it. He'd reached out to the group where he got the game from and found that their service was disconnected. The narrator leaves the story with a simple inquiry into if anyone else had experienced this game. He wants to get to the bottom of this mystery. Ultima Abyss is a fairly grounded story that comes from the world of old internet piracy. Back then, there were a lot of games and mods being shared around the internet. The idea that someone could make a corrupt version of one of the most popular games at the time isn't so far-fetched. Of course, that changes with the section about the game somehow trapping the narrator in his room and them needing to be formatted before he was free. There's also the games deleting themselves, as what happened with Jeff. I don't necessarily hate these parts because I feel like a little bit of supernatural is fine in my creepypastas. Realism is nice, but sometimes I want the player to be affected outside of the game. Overall, the story had an interesting concept, but the events in the game were not all that interesting. Maybe it's because I have little knowledge of the Ultima series, but I just didn't feel creeped out or moved by anything happening in the game itself. There Are No Children is a Gothic 2 creepypasta. The story was uploaded to the wiki in 2012 by Morganon. The story doesn't have an author attached to it. The story follows another game gained from piracy, but this one seems to have a differing opinion on the ethics of it. The story begins with the narrator explaining that they often avoid torrenting games because it feels wrong to steal intellectual property. But the real reason is more unsettling. They recount an experience with their favorite game, Gothic 2, which they first played when it came out. When they wanted to replay it but couldn't find their game discs, they resorted to torrenting a version online. After downloading and installing a working version, they began playing normally until they reached an unexpected eerie part of the game. While exploring the monastery level in Gothic 2, the narrator stumbles upon a strange skeleton wearing a retextured fire magician's robe. After killing it, they find a mysterious key and accidentally trigger a secret lever, which leads them into an unfamiliar underground dungeon. This area is unlike anything they've seen in this game before. The prison-like structure is eerily quiet, with no music, and has locked cell doors along each floor. As they explore further, they hear a disturbing sound, the faint crying of a child. When they investigate, they find a shadowy figure in one of the cells, appearing like a small child, crying softly. The narrator, unsettled, chooses to continue exploring without interacting with the child. On the bottom level of the dungeon, they encounter strange torture equipment, which is graphically superior to what should be possible in the game's old engine. After pulling a lever, they check the child's cell again, only to discover it is now open and the figure has escaped. Terrified, they save their game and close it. The next night, the narrator returns to their computer and finds the game still open, despite thinking they had quit it. They continue playing, now obsessed with figuring out what's happening. In the child's cell, they find bloodstains and a message written on the wall that says "Mommy." As they explore further, they spot the child's figure again and hear disturbing noises. When they examine a knife they found earlier, the description reads, "Mommy made me. She didn't love me." Unable to find an exit from the dungeon, the narrator tries using a console command to teleport out. Instead, they end up in another cell, with the child creature right behind them. They desperately try to escape, but every attempt to reload the game places them back in prison. When they try to quit the game, a message pops up, "You can't leave me." In a panic, the narrator forces their computer to shut down. After restarting it, the game reappears, and a note in the game reveals the horrifying truth. The world of Gothic 2 has no children, but someone tried to create one. The result was a mysterious, monstrous, twisted being. The note warns that the creature is loose and that anyone playing the game is in danger. In the final moments, the creature catches the narrator's character and the game crashes. When they inspect the game's files, there's only one text file left, which warns the reader to uninstall the game immediately before the creature finds them. Horrified, the narrator deletes the game, reformats their computer, and eventually buys a new one. Despite these efforts, they still feel haunted, knowing that the creature is out there, looking for them. This terrifying experience serves as a warning to others. Don't torrent the game, or the creature may find them too. There Are No Children was a surprisingly interesting story about Gothic 2. The game does feel like a perfect choice for a creepypasta though. It has a similar vibe to Oblivion, where you can just find something creepy in the older RPG. The key part of the story that I find interesting is the creature itself. It is described well and sounds like it could be a great source of nightmare fuel. This feels similar in a way to an Oblivion creepypasta that I covered in the first gaming Creepypasta Iceberg. It has similar notes, and I quite enjoyed both of them. The story about downloading this monster is interesting to me as well, but quite overplayed. I have seen several stories of this era using pirated games, but at least they are unique in other ways. This was a surprisingly good story, and very engaging all the way through. Lone Wolf Radio is another Fallout creepypasta. I wasn't able to find the original author or where the story originated. I do know that the story was based on an area in Fallout New Vegas with some supernatural elements. The narrator of the story is talking about how they were revisiting Fallout New Vegas after a year-long break and found their save game at a strange location called Lone Wolf Radio. This derelict trailer, filled with radio equipment, had little valuable loot but was covered in disturbing graffiti. Outside, the words, "Keep Out," were spray painted, while inside, a chilling message written in blood read, "Everyone is gone. I am alone." Curious about the out-of-place area in the game, the narrator decided to investigate further. After searching for answers, the narrator found a person online who claimed to be a former Obsidian Entertainment employee named Thomas. Despite some skepticism, the narrator engaged with them to learn more about the mysterious location. According to Thomas, Lone Wolf Radio was originally intended to be part of a major quest line that was ultimately cut from the game. The quest involved a character known as the Lone Wolf, who would broadcast incoherent, sinister monologues on the radio, culminating in a series of murders. The intensity of the broadcasts would escalate if the player ignored them, eventually leading to the murder of a child. Thomas explained that the quest was cut due to its graphic nature. particularly the inclusion of a child being killed, which didn't fit the overall tone of New Vegas. The conversation between the narrator and Thomas unfolded as follows. How far along was the quest before it was cut? We were almost finished, but right before the game was ready, we got a message from upstairs that they wanted the entire quest line cut for undisclosed reasons. So I'm wondering, since the quest line was cut late in development, is there any way to get to it or something? I'm pretty sure some files would still be on there. When we cut material from the game, we often left the data in the files rather than completely deleting it. So you're saying all the files are still there? No, most of them are gone. You might find a couple of files on the disks. Do you know any way I could get to the rest of the files? Unless you worked at Obsidian, you're not going to find anything. With no further leads, the narrator was about to give up until they received an anonymous email 2 weeks later. The email contained the files for the Lone Wolf quest, but came with a warning. I heard you were looking for the files for the Lone Wolf quest. I attached them here. Don't reply back. Despite feeling uneasy, the narrator packed the files into an ESP mod and reloaded them into the game. At 2 a.m. in the game, they tuned into the radio and heard a disturbing broadcast from the Lone Wolf. All alone, I am the last true person alive. All around me, the skies weep and the earth howls for blood. The very pits of the grate below open for another offering. I hope this meager soul pleases you. Suddenly another voice interrupted the broadcast, one that didn't match any known voice actor from the game. Someone help me. I'm not supposed to be here. I only came for the audition. Confused by the sudden change in tone, the narrator listened as the Lone Wolf responded. You pathetic creature. You do not deserve to stand before the Mother of the Depths. Mother, take this flesh and enjoy its blood. The person started to plead for their life. The broadcast ended with the sound of a blade being driven into someone's torso, followed by a blood-curdling scream. Horrified, the narrator traveled to Lone Wolf Radio in-game and found the area altered. More blood covered the trailer, and new graffiti had appeared, including one message that read, Mother of the Depths, take this flesh. Inside the trailer, the narrator found the body of a man with a knife in his chest, and several fingers chewed down to the bone. The victim's model was more detailed than usual for Fallout characters, and the scene felt disturbingly real. The narrator noticed a file named Picture in the same game folder. Upon opening it, they were horrified to see an image of a man murdered in the exact same manner described in the quest, a knife in the chest and his fingers gnawed to the bone. The surroundings in the photo were eerily similar to the dilapidated trailer from the game. Frightened, the narrator contacted Thomas again to ask if he knew anything about the photo. Hey Thomas, I managed to get my hands on the files for the Lone Wolf quest, and what I saw really freaked me out. What was it? There was a picture of a person who had been murdered, and he looked just like the model of the character the Lone Wolf kills. That can't be right. I didn't put anything like that in the quest. This is making me feel really uneasy. I don't get what's going on here. Was there anything else? Other than the disturbing radio message, I didn't see anything else. Radio message. We never finished the voice acting. Shaken, the narrator realizes that something is terribly wrong. The voice acting they heard hadn't been completed by the developers, yet it appeared in the game. The next day, the narrator found their saved game replaced by a new one, featuring a level 1 character at Lone Wolf Radio. The trailer was fenced off, preventing them from leaving. Inside, they encountered the Lone Wolf again. This time he spoke of making an offering to the Mother of the Depths, and brought in a child. The child's cries were disturbingly realistic. The Lone Wolf raised a sledgehammer, preparing to kill the child as part of his offering. Just as the brutal act was about to occur, the game crashed. Upon reopening the game folder, the narrator found another file labeled Picture. This time the photo showed a child with their head caved in, drenched in blood. Sickened and terrified, the narrator deleted the Lone Wolf mod and uninstalled Fallout New Vegas, unable to continue playing. The terrifying experience left them shaken, and they avoided further contact with both Thomas and the anonymous sender of the files, unwilling to uncover any more of the gruesome mystery. This is another creepypasta that I can see where they pulled their inspiration from. Lone Wolf Radio pulls a bit from Fallout 3 Number Station and the plethora of stories that have a real murder hidden within the game's files. It's been an important and recurring element since Pale Luna did it. That doesn't take away from the story, since I think it was utilized really well here. I'm kind of a fan of stories that use a murderer hiding their murders through games. I think it's a cool plot device. I've seen it used many times over the countless stories that I've covered. Well, over 200 by this point. I still think it works well, but not as well as stories like Be Dice Sky that we covered earlier. I also have a soft spot for creepypastas based on Bethesda games. Oblivion, Skyrim, Fallout 3, and now New Vegas. These worlds really feel like they have so much to hide, and it feels like we can uncover so much through our explorations. The story had some flaws like the dialogue, but it was mostly an eerie tale of a murderer who hid his murders in a game mod. These were not the original game files that Obsidian created. They existed so a murderer could use them to disclose what he'd done. The real question is, who is the murderer and why did he choose New Vegas? Abbadon Tenebrae is a creepypasta uploaded to the wiki in 2012. It was uploaded by Why Am I Reading This, but lists no author. The story is obtained unusually, through 6 napkins that the author threw out of his window. The story begins with a kid explaining that he's not crazy. His name is Gerard, and he's writing this story down on some napkins he found while on psychiatric care. He explains that he needs to get out and finish a game of some kind before it's too late. It all started when he went over to his friend's house to play a game he'd found. His sister had bought a large batch of pirated DVDs, and the game was found there. It was an original game and not pirated. It was a PC game, and Gerard's friend had already installed it. The game was called Abbadon 1. It played similarly to classic Doom, where you needed to kill demons and you moved the camera with your arrow keys. The interesting part, though, was that the map you played on looked just like the neighborhood they lived in. Same houses, the same street names, and even the same people. A lot of the dead bodies that littered the ground during gameplay were those that lived in the neighborhood. The first napkin ends there. The second one picks up with a conversation between the two. Gerard's friend was showing him how the game worked. When you started a new game, you put in your name and birthday. It then generates a world for the player along with some other background information. In this case, Gerard's file said, Gerard Manrique, United States of America, Tennessee, Nashville, Libra with Pisces Ascendant, 4698131. The two had no idea what all that meant, but liked the game a lot. It had some allure to it, or maybe it was just the realism of it all. Being able to explore your hometown like that was something you couldn't do in other games. It was a novelty that really excited Gerard. Gerard had made his way through the level and finally met a giant red demon. The fight didn't last long before he saw the game over screen. It was as he'd expected. He'd found the first boss. Gerard left that day, but he was hooked on the game. He asked his friend to make a copy of it for him to play. He played it when he got home. He played it again the next day. He played it through the whole weekend. He was hooked, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't beat the boss. When Gerard arrived at school on Monday, he found his friend and asked him about the game. His friend said that he was done with the game. He got bored of it, but he'd also been feeling sick lately. The computer was hurting his head whenever he got on it. This disappointed Gerard, as he was the only other person he could talk to about the game. Either way, he wanted to search the internet about the game and needed the original disc for that. His friend gave him the disc without hesitation. Gerard started his search into the game the second he got home. What he found wasn't much at first. That wouldn't matter to him much as he got to school the next day and got terrible news. His friend had passed away that morning. He was devastated. They had just talked the day prior. Gerard was devastated and so sunk into playing the last game they'd both enjoyed together. He still couldn't beat the demon and it made him feel even worse. This led to him searching the internet for a solution. He couldn't let this get to him. After a little more digging, he found an email attached to his search. It was the only thing he found. The email was from a person in Romania. He sent them a message just asking for information about Abbadon 1. 3 days later, Gerard noticed something disturbing while playing the game. There was the sad face of a boy in the window across from his starting position. It was in the game window where his friend's room would have been. He closed the game down. He just couldn't take it. That's when he saw he had a message in his email. It was from the Romanian email. This message said to look at the cross. He had no idea what that meant. As he loaded up the game, he had an idea. He turned around and headed into the house in the game. It was his house. Everything was exactly as it was in the game. He walked by his room and saw the door was closed. He could hear a game being played behind the door. He dared not enter. Instead, he headed towards the only cross in the house, and this is where he found the answer to what he was looking for. When he aimed at the cross, he saw strange words and numbers appear. The first number is the distance from the darkness of the contract. The second is the day from the day of the contract of darkness. When Abbadon is defeated, the original date is returned. Underneath the words is a blue bow with a single arrow. The words didn't mean anything to him, but the bow looked like the item needed to defeat the boss. He knew that somehow. He left the game running and checked his parents' room where the cross was in real life. He didn't see a bow or any words. He cried for a bit before returning to his room. The screen showed that he had died and the bow was destroyed by a demon that had entered his home. The next day after school, Gerard told his mom that he was sick. She let him stay home, which was good because he was ready to find out what the game was doing. He entered the game again, but the bow was still gone. Frustrated, he messaged the Romanian email again. He typed the words written on the cross and hoped for a response. Luckily this time, the response came quickly. He was told that he was young and that it was unfortunate. The person explained that the game had a unique way to invest the player. When you give the game your name and birth date, you are trading the date of your death for whichever one Abbadon gives you. This was done to make the game have more of a personal connection to each player. You have to defeat him to get your original date of death back. Gerard had broken the game disc and its copy a day prior, and that clearly hadn't worked. As he was thinking how he could defeat Abbadon, a demon flew in through his window and started to torment him in real life. His screams pulled his mom upstairs. The following day, he was brought to the hospital and sat in a room with a bed, a desk, and a window. He could see the demons circling in the sky. They would occasionally fly down and stare at him through the window. Gerard finished the writings on the last of his napkins. He pleaded with whoever found this story to tell someone to let him out. He needed to get the bow and defeat Abbadon before it was too late. He planned to throw the napkins out the window when the demons weren't so close to it. An ending message said that the existence of the game was never confirmed. The only odd thing was something that the parents had remarked on. They'd found their son's email and found it so strange that he was writing in perfect antique Latin. Abbadon Tenebrae is such a weird story to me. For one, I really like the concept that it presents. A game where you trade your date of death for one given to you is interesting. It could have taken that idea further, and I wish it did. Regardless, I think it was a good story, though. The writing sounds like it was translated to me. The author mentions speaking Spanish as their native language one time in this story. So maybe it was translated from Spanish to English, which would explain some of the weird wording. The story is paced well, and it was honestly a surprise with all the mediocre stories I've been sifting through lately trying to make this iceberg. This story may have needed more to be great, but it was still pretty good as is. I recommend checking it out if you have the time. Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Screams is a story that was uploaded to the Creepypasta Wiki in 2013 by Mattboy115. Here we have another Mario story. The narrator starts the story by saying that Super Mario RPG is one of their favorite games of all time, despite a disturbing experience that would forever change their view of it. One night, feeling tired of playing newer games like Minecraft and Team Fortress 2, the narrator decided to revisit this classic game from their childhood. They hoped it might inspire them to work on their webcomic, which was based on the game. After digging out their Super Nintendo and cartridge collection, they noticed something unusual. The Super Mario RPG cartridge was strangely hot to the touch, even though it hadn't been used in months. Despite this oddity, their curiosity got the better of them, and they inserted the cartridge into the console. Immediately, things began to feel off. Instead of the usual opening sequence where Princess Toadstool is kidnapped by Bowser, the game presents a completely different scene. Princess Toadstool was sitting in a flower patch, crying uncontrollably, while Mario appeared and sat beside her, offering silent comfort. The game's usual upbeat music was replaced with a haunting sound of crying, a sound the narrator had never heard in the game before. Mario and Toadstool seemed to be mourning a loss, and as the scene continued, it became clear to the narrator that Luigi had died. The title screen faded in, but it was no longer the familiar Legend of the Seven Stars title. Instead, the game now reads, Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Screams. Alarmed but intrigued, the narrator felt compelled to continue. The file selection screen was also altered. Instead of the 3 saved games they had carefully worked on, there was only one file left, ominously titled Payback. Mario's character sprite, usually happy and smiling, now had a menacing expression. Still, the narrator pressed forward, eager to uncover what had happened to Luigi and why the game had taken such a dark turn. As they entered the game world, it was clear that everything had changed. The once bright and cheerful Mushroom Kingdom was now a wasteland. Charred enemies littered the ground, and familiar locations like Mushroom Way had been decimated. With flattened hills and ash where the flowers used to be. When the narrator checked Mario's stats, they noticed a new attribute, Rage, highlighted in red alongside the usual health and attack stats. Mario's sprite reflected this anger, his face twisted into a perpetual scowl. The atmosphere grew darker as the narrator ventured deeper into the game. When they reached the skeletal remains of a Hammer Bros boss, Mario stepped forward, touched the bones briefly, and then smashed them into pieces with his hammer. This gruesome display shocked the narrator, but they continued. Arriving at the Mushroom Kingdom, they found it in ruins, with injured toads wandering the streets, too traumatized to speak. The once bustling town was now eerily quiet, save for faint wailing in the background. When Mario entered the castle, a toad scolded him for not arriving sooner and expressed concerns for Princess Toadstool. The toad suggested Mario meet with the Chancellor before speaking to the princess. Inside the throne room, the narrator was greeted with a horrific sight. The room was wrecked with bodies of toads scattered across the floor. When Mario finally spoke to the Chancellor, his demeanor was different. He no longer cared about saving the kingdom or its people. His only concern was revenge for Luigi's death. Mario declared his intention to track down whoever was responsible and kill them in the most brutal way possible. Mario then lashed out at the Chancellor, smashing him with his hammer and killing him in cold blood. The remaining toads were horrified as their once beloved hero brutally murdered their leader. Princess Toadstool, having witnessed the act, confronted Mario. She questioned his actions, but Mario, visibly shaken by what he had done, declared himself a lost cause and suggested he should leave forever. However, before he could leave, the castle rumbled and a monstrous alien creature emerged from the Chancellor's body and initiated a battle with Mario. The fight was short-lived. The alien mauled Mario in a single hit, killing him instantly. The screen faded to black as the alien consumed Mario's body, leaving the remaining toads and Toadstool to mourn. The game then transitioned to a memorial service for Mario in Nimbus Land, with a wreath bearing his picture and the sound of weeping in the background as the credits rolled. After the credits, Luigi appeared on the screen with an evil grin, giggling maniacally before the screen went to black. When the narrator restarted the game, everything returned to normal. Their save files were restored, and the disturbing events of the Legend of the Seven Screams were gone, as if they had never happened. Mario was once again happy, and the game resumed its usual tone. Though relieved, the narrator couldn't shake the eerie experience and was left wondering what the game had been trying to tell them. The strange events never recurred. But the haunting memory is forever imprinted in the narrator's mind. Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Screams is a story that I expected to be bad, but it wasn't actually. It wasn't spectacular, but I cared enough for the world it was creating. It wasn't really creepy, but I did find the story interesting enough to follow it through all the way to the end. Red Rescue Team Hack, or Depressing Rescue Team Hack, is a creepypasta that comes from the Some Ordinary Gamers wiki. It's a story about a hacked version of Red Rescue Team. I know, it's all in the title. The story was uploaded by Joker's The Fix. The story begins with a narrator explaining that, while searching through pawn shops for unusual or bootleg video games, he comes across a peculiar cartridge simply labeled Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, in all caps. Despite its shabby appearance, the narrator's curiosity got the best of him, as he had an interest in strange and eerie Pokémon games, like Creepy Black and Lost Silver. As the game booted up, the title screen was a glitched mess, barely recognizable, and colors were all washed out and dull. It was as he thought, not a normal copy of the game. Nonetheless, the narrator pushed forward, starting a new game. However, the quiz sequence used to determine the player's Pokémon was incomprehensibly garbled, with characters and numbers replacing text. Despite the glitches, the narrator managed to complete the quiz, and his character was revealed to be a Cubone, something that piqued his interest, given Cubone's tragic backstory. From there, the game grew stranger. The usual introductory scenes were skipped, and the narrator was thrown directly into a dungeon, bypassing the process of selecting a partner. The dungeon was glitched, with walls and enemies melding into each other. Combat was oddly easy. Enemies were stuck in walls, unable to fight back, and the narrator's Cubone, nicknamed Crybaby, ruthlessly defeated them without resistance. Yet, the game's atmosphere felt increasingly off-kilter. Crybaby's level-up messages were disturbing, with him saying, "Mommy," instead of the usual upbeat lines about feeling stronger. As the narrator delved deeper into the dungeons, the environment became even more broken. The graphics deteriorated further, and Crybaby continued leveling up through the use of an item called Formula, which appeared to reference baby formula. Crybaby's strange utterances continued, and by the time he evolved into a Marowak, something not normally possible in Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, he began saying, "Daddy." The tone of the game grew darker and more foreboding, as if something sinister lurked beneath the surface. The endless dungeon eventually changed, shifting to gray walls and red splotches. Crybaby continued to defeat enemies that were glitched and trapped, unable to fight back. The monotony and eerie atmosphere weighed heavily on the narrator. He found himself inexplicably attached to Crybaby, feeling responsible for the Pokémon's well-being despite the increasingly bleak and haunting experience. He even encountered a Rattata, which he refused to add to his team, only for the game to respond with a chilling, broken message. The Rattata remained frozen, trapped in the game's glitchy world, symbolizing the narrator's growing unease. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the narrator reached what seemed to be the end of the dungeon. Crybaby, now at level 28 and over-leveled, found himself in a large empty room. No enemies, no exits, just a hollow space. When Crybaby attempted to move forward, he became trapped in the same glitchy walls that had ensnared his previous enemies. Suddenly the room filled with Pokémon that Crybaby had defeated throughout his journey, and they slowly drained his health while he remained stuck and helpless. As the screen faded to black, the narrator's DS shut off by itself. Desperate to see what happened to Crybaby, the narrator restarted the game, only to find that the continue option was broken, leading back to Crybaby trapped in the same room, surrounded by endless, respawning enemies. The one lighthearted level up message had become horrifying pleas like, "Daddy help me," and "Daddy kill me." At this point the narrator was shaken. The Pokémon that he had become attached to was now locked in a perpetual cycle of torment, trapped in an unending nightmare. He was deeply disturbed by the events, locked the cartridge away, unable to bear the thought of losing Crybaby again. The experience had gone far beyond a simple glitched game. It forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his actions. By exploiting the game's glitches, he had led Crybaby into a digital hell where the Pokémon was condemned to an eternity of suffering. Though the game was likely a product of bad programming or a broken cartridge, the emotional journey profoundly impacted the narrator, who now keeps the cartridge hidden, refusing to let anyone else experience the horror of Crybaby's fate. In the end, he reflects on the experience, haunted by Crybaby's endless suffering and by the realization that even in virtual worlds, human actions can lead to cruelty and despair. Pokémon Forgotten Yellow is a creepypasta about a miscolored copy of Pokémon Red for the Game Boy Color. The story opens with our narrator, Jeff Anderson. He explains that he has a story to tell about a weird encounter he had with a copy of Pokémon. While listening to music in his car, he heard an ad come on over the radio. His local GameStop was having a sale on used games. This ad seemed almost too perfect, as he'd just been thinking that he wanted to play his old Game Boy Color again. Jeff headed into GameStop before going to work. He found a man working in the back, placing some PS2 games on the shelf. They talked for a moment before Jeff asked if he had any old Pokemon games in the back. The man nodded, said yeah, and walked towards the rear of the store. The man set down a box of Game Boy Advance and Color games. Jeff glanced over them and grabbed 3 games that looked like the Pokemon games he was after. He paid for them and took them out to his car. He drove to work and left the games in the passenger seat. After work was over, he sat in his car and finally took stock of the games he'd bought. Pokemon Silver, Pokemon Yellow, and Pokemon Red were the 3 he'd bought. Oddly though, each cartridge was the wrong color. The one that caught Jeff's eye the most was the Pokemon Yellow cartridge, which was red instead. Jeff, after arriving home, took the red cartridge inside. He grabbed his old Game Boy Color and cleaned it up before placing the game in the socket. He started it up and it froze momentarily on the Game Freak logo, but proceeded normally after that. He was taken to the start screen and clicked past it. Jeff tried to click New Game, but was instead brought into someone's already started game. The character's name was Death, he had no badges, and the only Pokemon he had was Pikachu. Regardless of all this, he pushed forward in the game and entered Oak's lab. The game was acting oddly, to put it mildly. The characters would flicker between the usual colors and black and white. In Oak's lab, there appeared to be an NPC stuck in the wall, with a red liquid under them. He assumed it was blood. Jeff walked up to Oak and started to talk to him. Oak had no eyes and said something weird. He said, "No one knows our pain." After this encounter, Jeff headed back to the player's house. He enters and it gets weirder from there. The house is all red. The character's mom is gone and the sprite is just a white outline. He walked up to the TV and got another weird message similar to Oak's. He talked about how pain was coming. Jeff tried to shut off the game but got another message on the screen that said he wasn't allowed to leave. He finally stopped the game by pulling the cartridge from the console. It finally shut off after that. Tired, Jeff decided to call it a night. The next day, Jeff decided to try the game again. He was hopeful that it would play normal this time. He was very wrong. The game skipped all of the startup screens and jumped straight into the character lying in bed. When Jeff tried to move the character, he found that he couldn't and had to watch him move towards the TV by himself. The TV's dialogue mentioned something about rain, and when the character went outside, it was raining. The screen started to distort while outside. The music was doing the same, making a high-pitched squealing. The screen cut to black with just text appearing in white. It appears that he has arisen. Bone by bone, broken down from the souls of the tortured, he has returned. The character reappeared in a cave. Jeff was back in control and found that he could explore the cave. While moving, he was brought into a battle screen. There was no opponent on the other side. It was just a character on screen. After a moment, a message popped up saying Pikachu had died. The next message said Jeff had blacked out. Jeff never told the game what his name was. It was named Death before. The game screen went black before loading into a room with the character lying on the floor. There were bodies of the other characters littered all around him. New text appeared on screen saying that he had arrived. The game cut to a game over screen before cutting to black. Jeff got rid of the cartridge after this. He just hopes that no one has to see what he saw in that game he calls Pokémon Forgotten Yellow. Pokémon Forgotten Yellow could be a better story. It lacks any real plot and scares. We have a character that purchased a strange version of Pokémon Yellow. Stranger still is that he played it for as long as he did. There's not much to say about this story except that the ending mentioning the name of the story was not for me. Let's move on. Talking Angela is a creepypasta that was written in 2014 and focuses on the conspiracy of the mobile app Talking Angela. The story was written by the same writer who created Maria's Revenge, a Sonic creepypasta. I'm using their DeviantArt name of We Act on Impulse. The narrator begins their story by discussing a conspiracy theory about the mobile app Talking Angela. Talking Angela is an app where you can talk to an anthro cat. She asks you questions and you answer them. You can also ask her questions and she'll give you the answers. The cat talks using an early feminine AI voice. The story goes into Facebook posts and some reviews focus on the game. The Facebook post gives a warning about the game, saying it's spying on its users and trying to get personal information out of them. You'll even ask personal or perverted questions sometimes. The post then claims that you can see a person hiding in the image of Angela if you look closely at her eyes. This conspiracy was spreading from Facebook and the App Store, but there were also posts fighting against these claims. The narrator was unsure what to believe at the time, but they were curious enough to dig into the files of the app. This idea came from two particular points. The first was a strange conversation the narrator had with Angela when she asked if he liked animals, and then went silent for a while. This seemed pretty innocuous, but the second point comes from an article found online. Supposedly a 7-year-old child had gone missing after downloading the app. The article went into detail on how the writer believed someone was using the app for this nefarious act. The narrator decided to test how much Angela knew with another conversation. This time they'd planned to see what kind of questions Angela would ask. The topic turned to the weather, and the questions kept getting more and more specific. The app was clearly trying to figure out where the narrator lived. They eventually dropped the questions when they kept responding with nonsense answers. One night after a particularly hard day of school and work, the narrator decided to break into the game's files. The files were extracted from the APK and he started to browse through it all, which is how he ends up finding a different side of the app. There was what looked like an entire other app hidden in the code of Talking Angela. This code, when compiled, led to a chat application. The Talking Angela app opened up with client control service listed at the bottom. Then it went to a black screen with a chat service message saying connected. A message would then appear on his screen, STR. It wasn't anything that he understood, and he asked the other person sending it what it meant. As soon as he did, the other person disconnected. The next person popped in immediately and typed the same thing. When asked, this person gave a response. It meant send to receive. When asked what that meant, they disconnected again. The next person popped up with the same message. This time the narrator responded with you first. He was sent a string of letters and numbers. The other person asked for something in return, but the narrator didn't know what to send, and they disconnected as well. The narrator then took that string of characters and found a spot to place them in the app. Once he did, a video popped up on his phone. It was of a little girl playing Talking Angela. The conspiracy was true. The little girl asked a question and he answered and saw his answer appear on screen. Feeling disgusted, the narrator checked where the other string of characters led. Most led to nothing important, just empty rooms and desk drawers. Eventually, he went back onto the chat server and got a reply from someone with a link to a woman dressing. He didn't go to the link and instead jumped to the next conversation. He was asked to send another string, and he sent over the one from the prior message. The guy responded that it was disgusting and it definitely didn't lead to what it claimed to. The narrator figured he'd seen enough and wanted to send all the details over to the police. He gathered everything he could and took it in. A while later, 2 FBI agents showed up at his house, took his phone, and gave him a replacement. They claimed they needed it for evidence. The phone they gave him was an older version of the phone he already had, but he didn't want to use it since he was sure it was bugged. Later, he would receive a message from the Department of Justice claiming that nothing wrong was found with the Talking Angela app. They were not able to find anything wrong with the app and nothing like what he described. He was sent back his phone and told he could keep the loaner as well. The narrator ends the story by telling everyone not to download Talking Angela. Talking Angela was a decent story with a well thought out plot. There were sections where I felt like the story meandered too much, especially with the conversations with the app. I get that you need some build up, but there could have been more frightening things witnessed through the app. The ending also wasn't great in my opinion. The FBI stealing your phone makes sense, but the cover up was too much for me. I do like the premise a lot because it feels like it could happen. I also have some theories about the story. I don't think the agents that showed up at the narrator's house were real. I think the police must not have taken the story seriously. It came from a Facebook post after all, so instead they did nothing with it. Then the people behind the app got 2 people to pretend to be FBI agents and sneak in and make him feel like none of it was real. You wouldn't just receive an email from the Attorney General like you did in the story. So the cover-up could have been by those who made the app. This just makes sense to me. Though I'll have no way of knowing without contacting the author. Overall, an enjoyable story. The Phantom Game is a Half-Life creepypasta specifically about the PS2 version of the game. I couldn't find the author of the story or anything more than a narration of it on YouTube. The video was a re-upload, so I couldn't even find the date of the story's upload. The story begins with a girl calling herself Midori. She found a strange copy of Half-Life for the PS2 in her front yard. She decided to try the game out and found that it had a new sub-menu. How the menu looks depends on the number of your living relatives. It gives all their names as options for naming your character. This was odd, but she also recommends not using your real name. The reason this isn't recommended is because the name of the person you choose will feel the pain of the in-game player. This is a scary thought and something the narrator takes seriously. She hides her PS2 in the closet because she has friends coming over that day. Her friends were coming over to play an emulated copy of Polybius. They didn't believe the rumors about the game and wanted to see what it was all about. Before she could start that game, one of her friends found a copy of Half-Life and asked if they could play that instead. Midori explained that her PS2 was broken and she had to throw it away, but it was found almost immediately in her closet. They begged her to play that instead, and she gave in as one of her friends had psychic powers and could somehow always get her way. The game had her choose a name, and she went with her friend Mai's name, who was sitting on the bed behind her. The game was going well until Midori took the first bit of damage, and everyone realized that it hurt Mai. Midori wanted to stop the game, but the psychic friend kept telling her to continue. This would go on for a bit until Mai passed out from the pain. She stopped the game, but the other friend continued after forcing her way past the other 2 friends. There were 2 tried to stop her from playing and wanted to attend to their friend. She played it and didn't seem to care that it was hurting Mai. Finally, Midori took the disc out of the PS2 and threw it into a trash can outside. Her friend's pain stopped immediately, and she was glad to have figured out it was connected to the game. Later that week, she went out to check if the game was still in the trash can, only to see a raccoon running away with the disc in its mouth. According to the online research she did later, this has been reported online 51 other times. Each time the disc was stolen by a raccoon and they never saw it again. I'm not sure where to start with this story. I guess I'll start with some positives. I like the idea of a game making the player feel the same pain that is happening on screen. When utilized correctly, this can be a cool way of telling a story. You can add a bit of gravity to the situation. Here, it is used very poorly. The idea that you can just pick a name from a list of people that you know was fine, but the narrator, Midori, doesn't seem to make the connection to what it does very quickly. They hurt their friend, and they should be able to tell right away what is happening. The bit with the psychic friend was not great either. I don't understand what this was supposed to mean. Most likely it meant that she was very persuasive, but that shouldn't matter when they were hurting their friend. There's also no resolution to any of that. The narrator throws the disc away after taking it from the PS2. The girl was still playing it even if it was hurting their friend, which is pretty sadistic, but wasn't explored more than that at all. Which just makes it weirdly hard to follow. Overall, not a great story, and I don't recommend it. Cheat and Play is a creepypasta revolving around one of the most popular games of the Nintendo 64 era, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. The story was posted to the Some Ordinary Gamers wiki in 2014 by The Fairest One. The narrator starts the story by saying they'd recently discovered creepypasta. She'd always avoided forums and thought that's what creepypasta were. She was right in a way, but soon found that she loved the stories being shared and quickly fell down the rabbit hole of them. She wanted to share her experiences with her favorite game, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. She shares how she stumbled upon a strange cheat code on an eerie website titled Cheat and Play. While visiting her father in rural Michigan, she set up a space for herself in the basement. Here she could play her games to her heart's content without being bothered. This also meant that she could enjoy late-night gaming sessions as often as she wanted. Late one night, she decided to look for a cheat code to skip the Kokori Forest and the Deku Tree sections at the beginning of the game. After an exhaustive search, she discovered an unusual link labeled Cheat and Play that seemed to appear from nowhere. Though the link made her suspicious, she clicked on it anyways. After a delay, the webpage loaded, presenting a minimalist design with cheat codes for various Nintendo 64 games, including Ocarina of Time. She found the desired cheat for level jumping and wrote down the instructions, even though a small warning underneath cautioned that the cheat might cause complications and glitches. Excitedly, she started a new game, input the cheat code, and discovered a hidden cave within Link's treehouse, just as the instructions described. Entering this cave, she expected to reach Hyrule Field, but instead arrived at a warped version of a Great Fairy fountain. The fountain, once vibrant, now appeared dark and decrepit, filled with an eerie silence that contrasted the usual music. When the Great Fairy finally appeared, she was a horrifying corrupted version of her usual self, with darkened features and disturbing red handprints on her body. Instead of offering a gift, the fairy loomed ominously over Link, saying one single line, "Play a song for me." The narrator didn't know what to do. She hadn't played any of the game yet and wouldn't even have an ocarina yet. She tried to leave but was turned around by the game automatically. This is when she saw the corrupted Great Fairy was closer now. She loomed directly over Link. With a mounting fear, the narrator opened their inventory and found a mysterious black ocarina. Reluctantly, she selected it and chose to play the Song of Time. The fairy, however, rejected it, insisting they play a new song called The Song of Death, which appeared on screen the same way other songs are learned in the game. The haunting melody triggered the fairy to perform a grotesque backflip before freezing in place. The screen flashed again before coming back in with the fairy face down in the fountain filled with blood. A warp pad appeared just as a booming voice told her to get out. The story ends with the narrator warning others of what she'd found. If you find the website, do not use the codes it gives you. Cheat and Play was a surprisingly good story set in a sea of Zelda-based creepypastas. There are so many Legend of Zelda stories that you could make an entire iceberg chart on just those alone. The same goes for Pokémon, Mario, and Sonic. The story felt grounded and like something I would have enjoyed reading late at night in a dark room. It had the perfect vibe of a late night creepypasta session. which is pretty much all I ask of these stories. They don't need to be the most beautifully written story ever. No, they just need to be entertaining and creepy.